A young woman walks into a trading post with 32 jars of honey. 3 months of backbreaking work, every jar sealed by hand, every drop pulled from hives her dead father left behind. The trader looks her in the eye and offers $10. $10 for $56 worth of goods. He knows she is alone. He knows she is in debt. And he knows that he already owns that debt because he bought it from the bank 6 months ago. He is not just cheating her, he is destroying her, $1 at a time, so he can take the only thing she has left. But today, a stranger walks through that door. A cowboy covered in trail dust who has not slept in 3 days and has no business getting involved. He picks up a jar of honey, holds it to the light, and says 5 words that change everything. I will take 10 jars. What happens next is a story about a woman who refuses to lose her land, a cowboy who carries a dead man's ghost in his chest, and a villain who kills with paper instead of bullets. There will be fire, there will be betrayal, and there will be a moment when a man with a loaded gun pointed at his heart chooses to keep his hands empty. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning. This story will remind you of 2 things. First, one single moment of courage, one choice to stand up when it would be easier to walk away, can change the entire course of your life. And second, the people worth loving are never the perfect ones. They are the ones brave enough to stay. You are listening to Wild West Stories, where the prairie winds carry tales of courage, love, and justice from the untamed frontier. If you have a heart for cowboys who fight for what is right, and love stories forged in dust and firelight, you are in the right place. If stories like this speak to something in you, hit that subscribe button so you never miss a new tale from the Wild West. Drop a comment and tell me, would you have stepped in the way Yates did? And if you know someone who needs to hear that standing up for what is right always matters, share this story with them.
Rosalie Jenkins knew the smell of a liar. It smelled like cheap tobacco mixed with old sweat, and the man behind the trading counter today reeked of it. She had been up since 4 that morning, loading 32 jars of wildflower honey onto the buckboard wagon her father had built the year before he died. Each jar was sealed with beeswax and wrapped in cloth she had torn from a flour sack. 3 months of careful work sat in that wagon bed. 3 months of tending hives in the Oklahoma heat, of smoking the bees gentle and pulling frames dripping with liquid gold, of straining and pouring and sealing by lamplight until her hands cramped and her back ached in places she did not know a body could ache. She wore her best remaining dress, the blue calico with the white collar that had faded from too many washings but still held its shape. Her mother's silver brooch was pinned at her throat, the only piece of jewelry she owned, and in the deep pocket of her skirt she carried the single-shot Derringer her father had given her on her 12th birthday. He had taught her to shoot it behind the barn, setting up tin cans on the fence rail until she could hit 3 out of 5 at 20 paces. "You never know when you will need it, Rosie," he had told her. "But if you do need it, you make that one shot count." She had not fired the gun since his death, but she carried it every time she went to town. Ardmore was not much of a town in September of 1884. A single main street of packed dirt flanked by wooden buildings, most of them unpainted, their boards already warping in the relentless Oklahoma sun. There was a saloon at one end and a livery stable at the other, with a blacksmith shop, a small hotel, and a handful of other establishments scattered between. The largest building on the street belonged to Silas Drummond, who ran the only general store and trading post within 50 miles. Rosalie pulled the wagon up to the hitching rail outside Drummond's store and sat for a moment, gathering herself. The morning sun was already punishing, pressing down on the town like a hot iron. She wiped her palms on her skirt, climbed down, and began carrying the honey jars inside. Drummond was waiting behind the counter. He was a tall man, thin as a fence post, with silver hair combed back from a high forehead, and pale blue eyes that always seemed to be calculating something. He wore a clean white shirt with sleeve garters and a vest that looked like it cost more than everything Rosalie owned combined. He smiled when she entered, the kind of smile a cat gives a mouse before deciding whether it is hungry. "Miss Jenkins," he said. "What a pleasant surprise. Please sit down. I will have my man bring some tea." "I did not come for tea, Mr. Drummond. I came to sell honey." "Of course you did. And what fine-looking honey it is." He picked up one of the jars, held it to the light streaming through the front window. The honey glowed amber and pure, clear as a gemstone, without a speck of sediment or a single air bubble. Rosalie knew it was the best batch she had ever produced. The wildflowers that spring had been extraordinary, carpeting the prairie in purple and gold, and her bees had worked themselves into a frenzy harvesting nectar. Drummond set the jar down and named his price. $10 for the lot. The number hit Rosalie like a slap. She did the math in her head, quick and sharp, the way her father had taught her. 32 jars at a fair market price of $1.75 each came to $56. Drummond was offering less than a fifth of their value. She kept her voice steady. "That seems low, Mr. Drummond." He shrugged with elaborate sympathy. "The market is soft right now, Miss Jenkins, and freight costs are up something terrible. I have to ship this product all the way to Dallas before I see a penny of profit. $10 is a generous offer, all things considered." He spoke so calmly, so reasonably, that for one terrible moment Rosalie almost doubted her own arithmetic. Almost. Then Drummond said something that changed everything. "I hear you have been having a hard time of it lately. $10 today is better than nothing tomorrow, would you not say?" The words were gentle. The meaning was not. How did he know about her finances? About the overdue mortgage payments, the letters from the bank that she stuffed into the desk drawer and tried not to think about? A chill crept down her spine despite the heat, and she gripped the edge of the counter until her knuckles went white. She was still trying to find words when the front door swung open and a cowboy walked in. He was tall and broad through the shoulders, wearing a trail-worn duster over a faded blue shirt. His boots were scuffed and caked with dust, and his hat looked like it had survived more than one stampede. He had dark blonde hair that curled at his collar, and several days' growth of beard on a jaw that looked like it had been cut from oak. He moved with the easy, unhurried stride of a man who had spent most of his life outdoors and was comfortable taking up space. He did not look at Rosalie. He walked straight to the back wall where the rope and tobacco were kept, picked up a coil of lariat, and tucked a pouch of tobacco into his shirt pocket. Then he turned toward the counter and stopped. His eyes moved from Rosalie to the jars of honey to Drummond and back. Something in his expression changed, subtle but unmistakable, the way a dog's hackles rise when it senses something wrong. He picked up one of the honey jars, uncapped it, and held it under his nose. He breathed in slow. "My mother kept bees," he said, to no one in particular, "in Texas, before the drought." And he set the jar down, looked directly at Drummond, and spoke in a voice that carried no more emotion than a man ordering breakfast. "I will take 10 jars, $2 each." He laid a $20 bill on the counter. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. Drummond's face went the color of old tallow, white with a faint yellow tinge around the edges. If a stranger was willing to pay $2 a jar right there in his own store, then his offer of $10 for 32 jars was not just low, it was exposed. Rosalie stared at the cowboy. He did not look at her. He looked at Drummond with those steady brown eyes, and waited. Drummond recovered quickly. He was not a man who stayed off balance for long. "Well, now," he said, "perhaps I was a bit hasty. I could go $30 for the remaining 22 jars." The cowboy did the math out loud. $2 times 22 is 44. He looked at Rosalie for the first time. "That agreeable to you, ma'am?" Before she could answer, a door at the back of the store opened and a second man stepped through. He was built like a freight wagon, thick through the chest and arms, with a flat, heavy face and small, dark eyes that held about as much warmth as a January river. His hand rested on the pistol at his hip in a way that suggested it spent a lot of time there. Rosalie heard Drummond exhale through his nose. The cowboy saw the man too, but his expression did not change. He simply and slowly pushed his duster back on one side, revealing the Colt revolver holstered at his waist. He did not touch it. He did not need to. The gun spoke for itself. The big man looked at Drummond. Drummond gave the smallest shake of his head. 44 it is, Drummond said quietly. He counted the bills out onto the counter with hands that were perfectly steady, which told Rosalie something important. This man was not afraid. He was calculating. He was filing this moment away for later use, and that scared her more than anger would have. She gathered the money quickly, $64 total, 20 from the cowboy, and 44 from Drummond, folded the bills into her apron pocket, and walked out of the store without looking back. The sunlight hit her like a wall. She stood on the boardwalk, blinking, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. The cowboy followed her out a moment later, coil of rope in one hand, tobacco in the other. He touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am." "Thank you," she said. "You did not have to do that." He looked at her for a long moment, and something passed across his face that she could not quite read. Then he nodded once and turned toward the hitching rail where a sturdy bay gelding stood waiting. Rosalie climbed onto her wagon and gathered the reins. As she turned the team toward the road, she glanced through Drummond's front window. She saw Drummond leaning close to the big man from the back room, speaking rapidly, and the big man's eyes were fixed on her wagon, tracking her direction with the cold patience of a hunter marking where the deer goes to water. Rosalie drove out of town with $64 in her apron pocket, and the feeling that today she had earned both money and an enemy. That night, Yates Ingram lay in the Rockingham bunkhouse staring at the ceiling and thinking about the green-eyed woman's hands. Not because they were beautiful, though they might have been, because they reminded him of something he had seen once on the trail, a wolf caught in a leg trap, snarling at every hand that reached for it, even the ones trying to open the jaws and set it free. The bunkhouse smelled like saddle leather and sweat, and the remnants of the beans and salt pork they had eaten for supper. 6 other men slept around him in varying states of noise. Coulter with his whistling snore, old Pete muttering in his sleep about some woman named Georgia. Yates had worked alongside these men for 3 years and knew almost nothing about them, which was the way he preferred it. He turned on his side and closed his eyes, and immediately the thing he did not want to think about rose up behind his eyelids like smoke. Abilene. 8 years ago. A saloon with sawdust on the floor and a piano that was missing 3 keys. Yates was 19, 6 months orphaned, 3 months drunk, and carrying a Colt .45 that he had learned to draw faster than any man he had met. It was the only thing he was good at, and that fact would ruin his life before the night was over. The man at the next table was drunk too. His name was Emmett Harker, though Yates would not learn that until the trial. He was 25 years old with a wife named Clara back in Wichita, who was 7 months along with their first child. He had been cutting an apple with a small paring knife when something Yates said, or the way he said it, or maybe just the whiskey set him off. He stood up, he shouted something, he waved the knife, and Yates drew. The Colt roared in the small room. Emmett Harker dropped like a puppet with its strings cut, dead before his body hit the sawdust. The paring knife skittered across the floor and came to rest against Yates's boot. It was no longer than his finger. The court in Abilene called it justifiable self-defense. A man with a knife had threatened a man with a gun, and the man with the gun had responded. Case closed. But Yates knew what the court did not know, or chose not to see. Emmett Harker was falling down drunk and holding a blade meant for fruit, not fighting. Yates had drawn out of fear, out of the hair-trigger instinct of a boy who had grown up too rough and too fast, and a man had died for it. He carried that death the way some men carry a bad leg or a blind eye. It was part of him now, woven into every decision he made, every town he rode into and every town he rode out of when things got too close, too comfortable, too much like staying. 8 years of drifting, 8 years of running. He opened his eyes in the dark bunkhouse and forced himself to think about something else. The man in Drummond's back room. Something about that thick jaw, those flat, dark eyes, had tugged at a memory Yates could not quite reach. He had seen that face before, or one like it. But where? He pushed the thought aside. It probably meant nothing. In the morning, Samuel Morrison called him into the ranch house office. Morrison was the owner of the Rockingham Spread, a big-shouldered man of 55 with a gray beard and hands like shovels. He poured 2 cups of coffee, handed one to Yates, and got straight to business. "Got a drive coming up," he said. 200 head to the Oklahoma City auction yards. 5 weeks from now. I need you to lead it. Yates nodded. He had led drives before. It was what he was best at, after the gun, and the gun he did not use anymore. "You start getting the herd sorted this week," Morrison continued. "I will give you 4 hands. Take the Washita crossing if the water is low enough, otherwise loop north through Purcell. I will have them ready," Yates said. He finished his coffee and went to work, pushing the memory of green eyes and white knuckles to the back of his mind, where it would stay for approximately 6 hours before crawling back to the front. 40 miles to the south and east, Rosalie Jenkins sat at her kitchen table counting money by lamplight. The farmhouse was small and clean and painfully quiet. Her father had built it with his own hands in 1873, back when the land was cheap and the future looked like something worth riding toward. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a wood stove, a sitting room with a stone fireplace. Nothing fancy, but solid. The kind of house that said someone had planned to stay. Rosalie had kept it spotless in the 2 years since his death. The floors were swept, the windows washed, the porch steps mended as best she could manage. She did it not because she cared about appearances, but because letting the house fall apart would mean letting go of him. And she was not ready for that. She was not sure she would ever be ready. She laid the $64 on the table and began sorting. 15 for this month's interest payment to the bank, 8 for chicken feed and seed corn, 3 for lamp oil and salt. That left $38, which sounded like a small fortune until she opened the drawer where she kept the loan papers. The original mortgage was 5 years old, drawn up by First National Bank in 1879. Standard terms, fair interest. Her father had never missed a payment until his heart gave out in the field. After that, Rosalie had kept up as best she could, but best was not always enough. She was 3 months behind now, and the bank wanted $200 in overdue principal by the end of November, or they would begin foreclosure proceedings. The total remaining on the mortgage was $780, a number that sometimes woke her up at 3 in the morning with its weight pressing on her chest like a stone. She pulled out the most recent demand letter and read it again. And this time something caught her eye that she had not noticed before. The letter was not from First National Bank. It was from an entity called Drummond Holdings. Rosalie frowned. She had never heard the name. She assumed it was some financial company in Oklahoma City or Dallas, the kind of faceless institution that bought and sold debts the way Drummond bought and sold flour and tobacco. She filed the letter back in the drawer and pushed the drawer shut. Later, she would remember this moment and wish she had pulled harder at that thread. She blew out the lamp and walked outside into the moonlight. The hives sat in 2 neat rows behind the house, white wooden boxes that glowed silver in the dark. She could hear the bees inside, a low, constant hum that vibrated up through the ground and into the soles of her bare feet. It was the sound she had fallen asleep to every night of her childhood, the sound her father had called the heartbeat of the farm. She walked among the hives and talked to them, the way her father used to. "Keep making gold for me," she whispered. "I need every drop you have got." In the morning, she crossed the creek to visit Hattie Birdsong. Hattie lived in a small cabin that she had built herself 40 years ago, back when this part of Oklahoma Territory was still called the Chickasaw Nation, and the only white men around were traders and missionaries. She was Cherokee, 60 years old, with a face as weathered as saddle leather and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. She had taught Rosalie's father the art of beekeeping 20 years ago, and she had watched over Rosalie since his death with the fierce, unsentimental love of a woman who had buried 3 husbands and outlived them all. Rosalie brought her a jar of honey and told her about the trip to town, about Drummond's insultingly low offer, about the cowboy who had stepped in. Hattie listened with her hands wrapped around a cup of chicory coffee, saying nothing until Rosalie finished. Then she set the cup down. "Drummond has been buying up paper on farms around here, child. You be careful with that man." Rosalie waited for more, but Hattie just looked at her with those sharp, dark eyes and said nothing else. How many farms? Rosalie asked. Hattie held up 4 fingers, slow and deliberate. 4 in 2 years. And your daddy's land, sweetheart. It sits right in the middle of the quilt that man has been stitching together. Yates Ingram had no good reason to ride 10 miles to the Jenkins farm on a Sunday morning. He had 10 jars of honey he did not need, and a question he could not stop asking himself, which was whether or not the woman with the green eyes owned a gun. He told himself he was going to see about buying more honey for the Rockingham kitchen. That was partly true. He had mentioned the wildflower honey to the ranch cook, a sour-tempered man named Harlan, who considered anything beyond salt and pepper to be dangerous foreign influence, and Harlan had grudgingly admitted that honey might improve his biscuits. But Yates had not actually secured an order. He was riding on instinct, and his instinct was saying that the look in Bull Harker's eyes as he watched Rosalie's wagon leave town was not the look of a man who was finished with something. The Jenkins farm sat 3 miles outside Ardmore on a piece of bottomland that caught the morning sun and held the evening cool. Yates saw it from the rise above the creek and pulled Duke to a stop to take it in. Small farmhouse, white paint peeling but the structure sound. A covered porch with a rocking chair. A vegetable garden, fenced against rabbits, with the last of the summer tomatoes hanging heavy on the vine. Behind the house, 2 neat rows of white bee boxes, maybe 20 of them, humming in the warm morning air. A chicken coop, a small barn with a sway in the roof that said it needed attention. The whole place had the look of something being held together by will alone, one woman's stubborn refusal to let go of what her father had built. Rosalie came out onto the porch when she heard the horse. She was wearing a work dress with the sleeves rolled up and her auburn hair pulled back in a simple knot. Her expression when she recognized him was not exactly welcoming. "Mr. Ingram?" "Ma'am. I was hoping to buy some more of that honey. Got a cook up at the Rockingham who wants to try it." She studied him for a moment. The way you study a horse you are thinking about buying, looking for the flaw that is not immediately visible. "How many jars?" "5, if you can spare them." She went inside and came back with the jars packed in a small crate. He paid her $2 each from his own pocket. She counted the money carefully and put it in her apron without comment. Yates should have left then. He had what he came for, and propriety did not encourage a single man to linger at a single woman's farm without reason. But as he was tying the crate to Duke's saddle, his eye caught something at the far end of the property. The eastern fence line had been cut. He walked over and crouched down. The wire was not broken by stress or weather. It was cut clean, the kind of cut that comes from a good pair of wire cutters applied with deliberate force. He ran his finger along the severed end and looked up at Rosalie, who had followed him. When did this happen? She glanced at the cut wire and shrugged. Must have been wild cattle pushing through. Yates did not argue. But he had spent 14 years working fence lines, and he knew the difference between an animal breaking through wire and a man cutting it. This was a man's work. He straightened up, went to his saddlebag, and pulled out a pair of pliers and a length of spare wire he always carried. Without asking permission and without saying a word, he began repairing the fence. Rosalie stood on the porch and watched him work. Her expression was a complicated thing. Irritation and confusion and something else she probably would have denied if asked. When he finished, she said only thank you, and he touched his hat and rode away. He came back 4 days later, this time with lumber in a pack frame behind Duke's saddle. The porch steps, he had noticed, were rotting through at the second and third treads, and the left rail was coming loose from the post. Rosalie met him at the gate. She looked at the lumber and then at him with narrowed eyes. "I did not ask for help, Mr. Ingram. No, ma'am. But those steps are going to put you through the porch floor one of these mornings, and I had some scrap lumber that was not doing anything useful at the bunkhouse." She considered this for a long moment. Then she went inside and came back out carrying a hammer. "If you're going to work on my porch," she said, "you are not going to do it alone." They worked side by side through the morning, pulling the rotten boards and fitting the new ones. Rosalie handled tools with the confidence of someone who had grown up watching her father build. She measured by eye, cut straight, and drove nails clean. They did not talk much at first, just the back and forth of "pass me that board" and "hold this end steady." But the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who understood that sometimes work was its own conversation. It was near noon when Rosalie drove a splinter deep into the meat of her palm. She hissed through her teeth and pulled her hand back, blood welling around the dark sliver of wood. Yates set down his hammer. "Let me see that." She hesitated, then extended her hand. He took it gently in both of his, tilting it toward the light. His hands were rough and calloused, the hands of a man who had roped cattle and dug post holes and slept on hard ground for most of his life. He pulled the splinter out with his fingernails, quick and clean, then went to the rain barrel and wet his handkerchief and pressed it against the wound. For a moment they stood like that, her hand in his, the cool cloth between them. Something passed through the air that had nothing to do with splinters. Rosalie pulled her hand back. "Thank you. You are welcome." She invited him to stay for dinner. Simple food, beans and cornbread and honey, eaten at the small kitchen table with the window open to catch the breeze. They talked, really talked for the first time. She told him about her father, Thomas Jenkins, who had come to Oklahoma Territory with nothing but a wagon, a mule, and 5 beehives, and had turned this piece of prairie into a home. Who had taught her to read, to cipher, to shoot, and to never let anyone see her bleed. Who had died 2 years ago with his hand on the plow and the evening sun on his face, and left her the only thing he had, this land, and the only skill he could give her, the knowledge of bees. Yates told her about his parents, a small ranch in East Texas, beautiful country, good water. Then the drought of '73 took the grass and the cattle, and finally his mother and father within weeks of each other. He was 14. He hired on where he could and kept moving, and he had been moving ever since. He did not tell her about Abilene. Not yet. Near the end of the meal, Rosalie mentioned the honey he had bought for the Rockingham kitchen. Yates hesitated 1 second too long, and she saw it. "There is no standing order from your cook, is there?" she said. It was not a question. Yates set down his fork. The truth was simpler than a lie and harder to say. "No, ma'am, I bought it myself. Out of my own wages." Her expression hardened in a way he was beginning to recognize. The walls going up, the drawbridge rising. "I do not need charity, Mr. Ingram. It was not charity. It was the best honey I have ever tasted, and I wanted it. The fact that buying it meant you got a fair price was just good luck." She studied him for a long time, looking for the lie. She did not find one, because there was not one to find. "You can come back," she said when he was leaving, the evening light catching the auburn in her hair, "if you want." Her voice was casual. Her eyes were not. That night, Rosalie was pulled from sleep by a sound that turned her blood to ice. It was not the normal daytime hum of her bees. It was a low, panicked roar, like thousands of small creatures screaming at once. She threw a shawl over her nightgown, grabbed the lantern from the kitchen table, and ran outside barefoot. The destruction was systematic. Someone had overturned 6 of her 20 hives, kicked the boxes apart, and stomped the frames into the dirt. Bees swarmed in furious clouds, their roar filling the night like a living thing. Honey pooled in the dirt, liquid gold bleeding into Oklahoma clay. Rosalie did not cry. She set the lantern down and went to work. She righted the hives that could be saved, moving slowly and deliberately among the frenzied bees, speaking to them in the low murmur her father had used. She was stung 11 times before she got the last box upright. Each sting was a small fire on her skin, and she ignored every one. When dawn came, she surveyed the damage. 14 hives remained intact. 6 were destroyed beyond repair, representing 6 months of careful work and nearly $100 in lost income. In the mud near the overturned hives, she found boot prints, large, heavy-soled riding boots, the kind cavalrymen wore, and a hand-rolled cigarette stub made with corn husk paper, the kind she had seen the big man in Drummond's store smoking. Yates arrived at sunrise, planning to help with the chicken coop roof he had noticed needed patching. He topped the rise above the creek, saw the devastation spread across the apiary, and put Duke into a canter. He found Rosalie sitting on an overturned hive box in the middle of the wreckage. Her face was swollen from stings, her nightgown torn and stained with honey and dirt. Her eyes were dry and burning like coals. Yates did not say everything will be all right. He did not say I am sorry. He swung down from Duke, took off his coat, and started rebuilding hives beside her. In silence, side by side. They worked for 3 hours. They saved what could be saved and laid to rest what could not. When it was finished, they went inside and Rosalie put water on the stove for coffee, and her hands began to shake so badly that she had to set the pot down and grip the edge of the counter with both fists. And then the words came out, not carefully, not in order, but in a rush, like water through a broken dam. The debt, the overdue mortgage, Drummond's name on her loan papers, the hives destroyed, the boot prints matching the big man in the store. "Someone is trying to drive me off this land," she said, and her voice cracked on the last word in a way that told Yates she had been holding this together with nothing but willpower for a very long time. "How much time do you have?" "End of November. $200, or he has the right to seize the property. Total on the mortgage is $780. Yates was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "We have 7 weeks," the word we hung in the air between them. "This is not your fight, Mr. Ingram. When I see the strong preying on the weak, it becomes my fight. Last time it was at a trading counter. This time it is a hell of a lot more serious." And then Rosalie Jenkins did something she had not done in front of another human being in 2 years. She cried. Yates did not rush to hold her. It was too soon for that, and he knew it. Instead, he placed his hand on the kitchen table between them, palm up, fingers open. An invitation, not a demand. Rosalie looked at that open hand for a long time. She saw the calluses, the rope burns, the knuckles scarred from years of hard work. It was an honest hand. She placed her own hand in it, and his fingers closed around hers, and neither of them spoke. Later, when the coffee had gone cold and the evening was settling over the prairie like a blanket, they sat on the porch steps, both exhausted, both unwilling to move. "Why did you really buy that honey?" Rosalie asked. The truth this time. Yates looked out at the damaged apiary, at the surviving hive still humming bravely in the dark. "Because I walked into that store and saw the bravest thing I have seen in 27 years of living. A woman standing alone against a man who was robbing her blind. And she did not flinch. And I thought, I have to know who she is." She looked at him. He looked at her. The kiss was not sweet or careful. It was rough and desperate, tasting of salt and sweat and exhaustion, and something underneath all that, like the first green shoot pushing through scorched earth. Rosalie gripped the front of his shirt. Yates cradled her face in his calloused hands, as if she were something that might break if he held too hard. When they pulled apart, both of them knew that something had shifted between them that could not be shifted back. Yates left that night. He did not stay. But on the ride back to the Rockingham, Duke stopped short and snorted, and Yates looked down. A line of kerosene glistened in the moonlight along the eastern fence of the Jenkins farm, poured deliberately along the base of the dry grass. Enough accelerant to turn a prairie field into hell with a single match. Rosalie Jenkins had spent 2 years believing she was fighting a bank. She was wrong. She was fighting a man, and the man was already inside the walls. The morning after the kiss, the morning after the kerosene, Rosalie did something she had been avoiding since the day her father died. She sat down at his old oak desk, pulled open the bottom drawer, and began going through his papers. The desk was the finest piece of furniture in the house, made of quarter-sawn oak with brass handles and a leather writing surface cracked with age. Her father had bought it at an estate sale in Fort Smith, hauled it home in the wagon, and set it in the corner of the sitting room where the morning light fell just right. He kept everything there: bills, receipts, seed catalogs, letters from his sister in Missouri, and, buried at the bottom, the documents that governed their lives. Rosalie found the original mortgage first. Dated 1879, drawn up by First National Bank of Ardmore. Standard terms, 6% interest, monthly payments of $12. Her father's signature at the bottom in his careful, deliberate hand, Thomas W. Jenkins. He had been paying on time for 5 years before his heart gave out. She dug deeper. Feed receipts, tax notices, a letter from the county assessor. Then, wedged between two seed catalogs, she found it. A single page, easy to miss. Official letterhead from First National Bank, dated March of 1884, 6 months before the story began. It stated in dry legal language that the bank had sold the mortgage on the Jenkins property to a party identified as Drummond Holdings at a discounted rate, as part of the bank's ongoing effort to divest non-performing assets. Rosalie read it twice. Then she read it a third time. Drummond Holdings. Silas Drummond owned her debt. She sat very still at her father's desk, the transfer notice in her hand, and the pieces fell together with the sickening clarity of a puzzle she should have solved weeks ago. Drummond bought her mortgage. Drummond offered her $10 for $56 worth of honey. Drummond's man destroyed her hives. He was not just cheating her. He was engineering her failure so that she could not make the payments. And when she defaulted, he would seize the land. Legally, cleanly, without ever raising his voice. She went to Hattie. The old woman was sitting on her porch peeling apples when Rosalie came across the creek with the transfer notice in her hand and murder in her eyes. Hattie looked at the paper, looked at Rosalie's face, and set the apple down. "Sit," she said. Rosalie sat. She spread the papers on the porch rail and told Hattie everything: the low price, the hive destruction, the kerosene on the fence line. Hattie listened without interruption, her dark eyes steady. When Rosalie finished, Hattie went inside and came back with a leather-bound ledger, the kind a storekeeper would use. She opened it on her lap. "I have been keeping records," she said. 4 families in 2 years. The Perkins family, the Warrens, the McCluskey brothers, old widow Tate. Every one of them owed money to the bank. Every one of them had their debt bought by Drummond. And every one of them lost their land within 6 months of the sale. She ran her finger down the entries. The pattern was identical in each case. Drummond bought the debt cheap. Then he used every tool available to make sure the farmer could not pay. He overcharged them at his store, the only store in 50 miles. Their property suffered mysterious damage. People who owed Drummond favors came by asking pointed questions about their finances, and when the payment came due and the money was not there, Drummond seized the land. All legal, all within the letter of the law. "He does not need guns," Hattie said. "He uses paper. Paper kills quieter than bullets." Rosalie stared at the ledger. 4 families. There was something else, Hattie added, almost as an afterthought. Reverend Crandall came by the Perkins place the week before they lost their farm. Said he was offering spiritual comfort in their time of need. But the next day, Drummond knew exactly how much money they had hidden in the root cellar. Every last dollar. Rosalie filed that detail away. It did not make sense yet. It would. Yates arrived at the farm that evening, and she showed him everything. The transfer notice, Hattie's ledger, the boot prints from the hive destruction that matched the heavy cavalry boots Drummond's man wore. They sat at the kitchen table, and for the first time they were not helper and helped, not strong and weak, not man and woman playing the roles that the territory expected. They were partners. Rosalie had done the detective work. She had uncovered the conspiracy. Yates brought connections, muscle, and a willingness to fight. Together they were something that neither was alone. On the ride back to the Rockingham that night, Yates passed through Ardmore's main street. Most of the buildings were dark, but a light burned in the back of Drummond's store. As Yates watched, the back door opened and Reverend Eli Crandall stepped out, looking left and right, like a man who did not want to be seen. His face was tight with worry. Yates noted it. He did not yet understand what it meant. That night, Rosalie sat at her father's desk, the transfer notice in one hand and her derringer in the other, and made a quiet promise to the empty room. She would not lose this land, not to Drummond, not to the bank, not to anyone, whatever it took, whatever it cost. Yates had a plan. It depended on three things: 600 pounds of honey, a Cherokee woman who feared nothing on God's green earth, and Silas Drummond not finding out that Yates Ingram had once killed a man with a single bullet in a saloon in Abilene, Kansas. The plan was simple in concept and brutal in execution. Rosalie needed $200 by the end of November to cover the overdue principal. But they both knew Drummond could invoke the acceleration clause at any moment and demand the full 780. So they planned for the worst. Step 1. Harvest the remaining 14 hives early, squeezing every drop of honey the bees could spare before winter shut them down. Step 2. Sell directly to farms in neighboring towns, bypassing Drummond's store entirely. If he could not control the market, he could not suppress the price. Step 3. Yates put up $35 of his own savings, nearly everything he had, to buy beeswax and wicking and molds. Rosalie would make candles, high-quality beeswax tapers that burned clean and bright and sold for 3 times the price per pound of raw honey. Hattie joined the fight. She lent Rosalie 5 of her own hives and opened up her network of Cherokee customers, families, and trading posts throughout the Chickasaw Nation, where Drummond had no reach and no influence. For 2 weeks, Yates and Rosalie worked every spare hour. They poured candles in the barn, labeled jars at the kitchen table, and packed crates by lantern light. Yates showed up before dawn and stayed past dark, riding back to the Rockingham only when duty demanded. They worked side by side, shoulder brushing shoulder, hands reaching for the same jar and touching. Rosalie laughed one afternoon when a bee landed on Yates's nose and he froze solid, eyes crossed, not daring to breathe, and the sound of her laughter hit him somewhere deep in his chest, like a stone dropping into still water. It was the best sound he had ever heard, and he was terrified of it. Then Drummond made his move. The legal notice arrived by courier on a Tuesday. Rosalie opened it at the kitchen table with Yates standing behind her. The language was formal and precise, the kind of language that costs money to produce and more money to fight. Drummond Holdings was invoking the acceleration clause in the mortgage contract. Due to the borrower's demonstrated failure of good faith, full payment of the remaining balance, $780, was demanded within 45 days. From needing $200, Rosalie now needed $780. It was impossible. They both knew it. Yates went out onto the porch. He stood there for a moment with his jaw clenched so tight Rosalie could see the muscles working from inside the house. Then he punched the porch post. The wood cracked, and his knuckles split open and blood ran down his fingers and dripped onto the boards he had repaired 3 weeks ago. It was the first time Rosalie had seen real anger in him. It frightened her, and at the same time it did something else, something she would not have admitted to anyone. It made her feel protected. She came out and took his hand and wrapped it with a clean cloth from the kitchen without a word. When she finished, she held his bandaged hand in both of hers and said, "We will figure something out." That same week, Samuel Morrison called Yates into the ranch house and dropped a second weight on his shoulders. The cattle drive to Oklahoma City could not wait. 200 head committed to the fall auction, buyers already lined up. Morrison needed Yates to lead it. Departure in 3 weeks. "I like you, Ingram," Morrison said, pouring whiskey into 2 tin cups. "But I run a ranch, not a charity. You ride for me, or you do not ride at all." It was not cruelty. Morrison was a fair man who said what he meant and meant what he said. But the timing was a knife to the gut. 3 weeks. The drive would take 2 weeks round trip. That meant Yates would be gone for most of the remaining time before Drummond's deadline. That Sunday, Reverend Eli Crandall stood in the pulpit of Ardmore's small, whitewashed church and preached about accepting God's will and the meek inheriting the earth. After the service, he approached Rosalie in the churchyard with a basket of preserves and a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Miss Jenkins, how is the honey business? Getting along well enough, Reverend? Found any new buyers? I hear Tishomingo has a good market for local goods." Rosalie looked at him. Every question he asked was exactly the kind of information that would be useful to Silas Drummond. She answered politely, naming the towns where she had been selling, and watched his hands shake as he nodded along. On the ride home, she told Yates what she had noticed. "The Reverend asked me things today that a preacher has no business knowing," she said, "and he could not look me in the eye while he asked them." Yates thought about the night he had seen Crandall leaving the back door of Drummond's store. The pieces were not yet complete, but the shape of something was beginning to emerge. That evening, Morrison poured Yates another whiskey and talked, as old men sometimes do, about the history of the county. "That's Snake Drummond," Morrison said, swirling the amber liquid in his cup. "You know, he used to be just like you and me. Had 40 acres east of here back in '69. Pretty wife, couple of kids. Then the crops failed 2 years running and the bank came calling. Took everything he had. His wife left him. Went back to her people in Tennessee." Morrison drank and set the cup down. "I almost felt sorry for him. Until he became the very thing that ruined him." Yates rode back to the farm to tell Rosalie about the cattle drive, about the choice Morrison had forced on him. But when he arrived, she was standing at the fence line with a lantern, and the look on her face stopped him cold. "The Reverend was here again," she said, 20 minutes after I told him about the new buyers in Tishomingo." Drummond already knows. There were two kinds of ghosts in Oklahoma Territory. The kind that haunted prairie graveyards under the moonlight, drifting between wooden crosses that the wind had knocked crooked, and the kind that sat on a black horse in the middle of the road and stared at you with a dead man's eyes. Yates Ingram was facing the second kind. He was riding back to the Rockingham, the conversation about the cattle drive still weighing on him, when Duke stopped short at the crossroads where the Ardmore Road met the trail north. The horse's ears went forward and his nostrils flared, and Yates's hand moved to the colt before his brain fully registered what he was seeing. Bull Harker sat on a black horse 10 yards ahead, blocking the road. The ember of a hand-rolled cigarette glowed orange in the dark, illuminating the flat planes of his heavy face. He was not holding a weapon. His hands rested on the saddle horn, easy and patient, like a man who had been waiting a long time and did not mind waiting a little longer. "Ingram," Bull said. His voice was deep and steady and held no particular emotion, which was more unsettling than anger would have been. Yates kept his hand near the colt but did not draw. "What do you want?" Bull took a long drag on the cigarette and blew the smoke upward where it dissolved into the stars. "My name is Cable Harker," he said. "Most people call me Bull. My brother's name was Emmett. Emmett Harker. He was 25 years old and he had a wife named Clara who was 7 months along with their first child. He was holding a paring knife he had been using to cut an apple. And you put a .45 slug through his chest in a saloon in Abilene, Kansas 8 years ago." The words fell into the dark like stones into a well. Yates felt each one land. "The court ruled it self-defense," Yates said, and heard how hollow the words sounded. Bull laughed. Not a real laugh, a sound like gravel shifting. "A jury of white men in a cattle town said so. Sure. But I was there, Ingram. I was sitting at the next table and I saw the whole thing. My brother was falling down drunk and waving a little knife no bigger than my finger. He was not going to hurt anyone. He could barely stand. And you pulled a colt and shot him dead before he could blink. The night was very quiet. Somewhere in the distance a coyote called and another answered. Yates did not defend himself further. There was nothing to defend. Bull was telling the truth, or close enough to the truth that the difference did not matter. Emmett Harker had been drunk and holding a paring knife, and Yates had shot him out of fear, the blind, animal fear of a 19-year-old boy who had learned to draw a gun before he had learned to think. The court called it justified. Yates never had. Yates. Bull laid out his terms. "Ride out of Ardmore," he said. "Tomorrow. Forget the Jenkins woman. Drummond is going to get that farm regardless of what you or she does. That is not changing. But if you leave, I will not tell her about Abilene, and I will not put you in a position where you have to use that colt again. And if I stay, then the whole town finds out who Yates Ingram really is, and that girl, she will know exactly whose hands she has been holding." Bull let the words settle. Then he touched the brim of his hat, a mockery of courtesy. turned the black horse, and rode into the dark. Yates sat on Duke at the crossroads for a long time, staring at the place where Bull had been. Then he rode to the Rockingham and did not sleep. 2 days passed. Yates did not go to the Jenkins farm. He threw himself into work at the ranch, moving cattle, mending fence, shoveling stalls, working until his muscles screamed and his mind was too exhausted to think, but it was never exhausted enough. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Emmett Harker falling, and now, mixed in with that old horror, he saw Rosalie's face, the way she had looked at him when she placed her hand in his, the trust in her eyes. He did not deserve that trust. He had never deserved anyone's trust. On the second night, he made his decision. He went to the stable, saddled Duke, rolled his bedroll, and tied it behind the cantle. He was leaving. It was what he always did, the only response he knew. When things got too close, too real, too much like something worth staying for, he ran. He was cinching the girth strap when a voice came from the stable doorway. "Last man I saw saddling up at this hour was running from his wife. But you do not have a wife, Ingram. So what are you running from?" Morrison stood in the lamplight with his arms crossed, gray beard bristling, eyes sharp as awls. Yates did not answer. Morrison waited. When no answer came, he said, "Whatever it is, running from it has not worked for the last however many years you have been at it. Seems to me a man might try a different approach." Then he turned and walked back to the ranch house, leaving Yates alone with Duke and the dark, and the question that circled overhead like a buzzard waiting for something to die. Yates unsaddled the horse. He went back to the bunkhouse. He lay down and stared at the ceiling and did not sleep. While Yates was wrestling with his ghosts, Silas Drummond was being efficient. He did not wait for Bull Harker to act. Bull was useful for breaking things and frightening people, but Drummond preferred more surgical tools. He sent for Reverend Crandall. Crandall arrived at the back of the store at 9 in the morning, sweating through his collar despite the November chill. Drummond poured him coffee, sat him down, and explained what he needed. "I want you to pay a pastoral visit to Miss Jenkins. Today, express your concern for her welfare, and in the course of conversation mention that you have heard some troubling things about the man who has been helping her. A cowboy named Yates Ingram. That he killed a man in Abilene some years ago. A man named Emmett Harker." Crandall's face went gray. "Silas, I cannot. You owe me $1,800, Eli. Your church does not bring in enough to service that debt. One word from me and you lose the building, the parsonage, and every shred of standing you have in this community. Now, are you going to make a pastoral visit? Or are you going to explain to your congregation why their church has been seized?" Crandall went. He found Rosalie in the apiary checking the surviving hives. He stood at the edge of the bee yard, hands clasped, smile fixed in place, and made conversation about the weather and the coming winter and the quality of this year's honey crop. Then, as if it had just occurred to him, he said the thing Drummond had put in his mouth. "I hear that cowboy Mr. Ingram has been helping you. A kind soul, I am sure. But did you know he killed a man in Abilene some years back? Lord have mercy. I just would not want you in any danger, Miss Jenkins." Rosalie went very still. The color drained from her face the way water drains from a sink, fast and complete. "Thank you, Reverend. Please leave now." Crandall left, but as he stepped off the porch, he set down a small package wrapped in brown paper. No note, no name. Inside was a jar of honey, one Rosalie had sold him months ago. A wordless apology from a man who did not have the courage to make a real one. When Yates rode up to the farm the next afternoon, finally having gathered enough courage to tell her the truth himself, he saw her derringer lying on the porch table beside the empty chair where she always sat waiting for him. The front door was closed, and for the first time since he had known her, the lamp inside was dark before nightfall. Rosalie was not angry that Yates had killed a man. People died in the West. Guns went off in saloons and men fell down, and that was the nature of the territory they lived in. She understood that. She had grown up with it. She was angry that he had let her trust him without telling her the truth. He had held her hand and kissed her and said "we" when talking about her fight. And the whole time he had been carrying a secret that could destroy both of them. In Rosalie Jenkins' experience, a man's silence was always the most dangerous kind of lie. Yates stood on the porch and called her name. She opened the door. Her face was calm in a way that was worse than screaming. He tried to explain. Abilene. The saloon. The drunk man with the little knife. The fear, the gun, the sound it made, the weight it left. 8 years of carrying a dead man's face in his memory. He told it all, standing there in the fading light, his hat in his hands, his voice steady, but his eyes raw with something she had not seen in them before. When he finished, she asked one question. "How long have you known Bull Harker as the brother of the man you killed?" "Since the night on the trail, after I left here. And you did not tell me." "I wanted to." "Wanting and doing are two different things, Mr. Ingram." She closed the door. Not a slam. A click. The quiet, deliberate sound of a lock engaging was worse than any outburst, because it said this was not a decision made in anger. It was a decision made in certainty. Yates stood on the porch for a long time. Then he put his hat on and rode away. 10 days passed. Rosalie threw herself into work with a ferocity that bordered on self-punishment. She was up before dawn every day, harvesting the last of the fall honey, pouring candles until her arms shook, packing crates and loading the wagon and driving alone to 3 different towns to sell her goods. She sold well, $120 in 10 days, which was more than she had ever earned in such a short stretch. But the math was still impossible. Drummond's acceleration clause demanded $780. She had, including the earnings from the trading post and everything since, a total of $224. She was still $556 short, and the deadline was 3 weeks away. Drummond sent an appraiser to the farm. 2 men in city clothes with measuring tapes and clipboards walking the property, evaluating the buildings, assessing the land. The kind of men who show up before a seizure, putting dollar signs on another person's life. Rosalie stood on the porch with the derringer in her pocket and told them they were not welcome past the gate. They left without arguing, but they would be back. She knew it, and they knew it. Hattie came by that afternoon. She sat in the kitchen and drank coffee and looked at Rosalie with the sharp, unsentimental eyes that missed nothing. "You cannot win this alone, child. Pride does not pay the bank. Pride is the only thing I have that no one can take from me." Hattie shook her head slowly. "That is what your father used to say. And look where it got him, dead at 52 with a plow in his hands and debts on his books." The words were harsh. Hattie meant them to be. But Rosalie just set her jaw and said nothing, and Hattie left with the heavy step of a woman who has said all she can say and knows it was not enough. The days grew shorter. November pressed down on the prairie with gray skies and a north wind that cut through clothing like a blade. The hives went quiet, the bees clustering deep inside their boxes for warmth, their activity reduced to a barely perceptible vibration. For the first time since Rosalie could remember, the farm was nearly silent. No humming, no buzzing. Just the wind and the creak of the barn roof, and the hollow sound of her own footsteps on the floorboards. On the last night of November, Rosalie sat alone at the kitchen table with her father's photograph propped against the lamp. Thomas Jenkins stared back at her from the tintype with his serious eyes and his heavy mustache, and the slight crook in his nose where a horse had kicked him when he was 20. She picked up a pen and a piece of paper, and she wrote a letter to Silas Drummond. She wrote that she was prepared to sell the farm. She named her terms, fair market value minus the outstanding mortgage, which would leave her enough for a train ticket and a few months of room and board somewhere far from Ardmore. She wrote it in clear, careful language, the way her father had taught her. When she finished, she set the pen down, folded the letter, and sealed it with a drop of candle wax. She stared at the sealed letter for a long time. Then she looked at her father's photograph. She pushed back from the table and walked outside into the freezing dark. Her breath came in white clouds. The stars were hard and bright and indifferent. She walked to the hives in her bare feet, feeling the cold earth bite at her soles, and stood among the silent boxes. They were not completely silent. Deep inside, if she pressed her ear to the wood, she could hear the faintest hum. Thousands of tiny bodies pressed together for warmth, sharing heat, surviving, waiting for spring. And standing there in the dark, she heard her father's voice. Not a ghost, not a miracle, just the echo of 1,000 evenings spent exactly here, his hand on her shoulder, his voice low and steady. The bee does not leave the hive in a storm, Rosie. She holds on, and she waits. Rosalie went back inside. She picked up the sealed letter. She tore it in half and then in quarters, and dropped the pieces into the stove where they curled and blackened and disappeared. Then she heard footsteps outside. More than one set, heavy, moving toward the back of the house, toward the apiary. She went to the window. Moonlight caught 3 figures crossing the field. 2 were shapes she did not recognize. The third, the one in front, was unmistakable even in silhouette. Bull Harker's massive frame, moving with purpose, and in his hand, bobbing orange against the dark, a lit torch. Rosalie killed the lamp. She drew the derringer. She backed into the darkest corner of the kitchen and pressed herself against the wall. Through the window, the torch flame bobbed closer. And she had 1 bullet left. Yates Ingram had not drawn his Colt in 8 years, 3 months, and 17 days. He knew the exact count the way a reformed drunk knows how long it has been since his last whiskey, which is to say constantly, and with the awareness that every day without is a victory and every day ahead is a test. Tonight, when he saw the glow of fire on the horizon where the Jenkins farm lay, he knew that count was about to end, or he was going to find another way. He had not been sleeping. He had not slept properly in 10 nights, not since Rosalie closed the door, not since Morrison's question had burrowed into his brain like a tick and refused to come loose. What are you running from? The answer was simple and devastating. He was running from himself, from the thing he had done in Abilene, from the man that thing had made him, from the terrifying possibility that someone might love that man and discover too late what he really was. He had been lying on his bunk in the dark, listening to old Pete mutter about Georgia, when he saw the orange glow through the bunkhouse window. Due east, exactly where the Jenkins farm would be. He was on Duke and riding before his boots were fully in the stirrups. On the way out of the Rockingham yard, he passed Morrison's house and bellowed loud enough to wake the dead, "Fire at the Jenkins place." The old rancher appeared in the doorway in his long johns, took one look at the horizon, and started shouting for hands. But Yates did not wait. He put Duke into a dead run, leaning low over the horse's neck, the cold November wind cutting at his face. The fire glow grew brighter as he rode, and he could see now that it was not the farmhouse, not yet, but the apiary, the field behind the house where Rosalie kept her bees. At the farm, Rosalie had done what she had been taught. She had fired her 1 bullet. The derringer cracked in the kitchen darkness, and the ball splintered the fence post 6 inches from the lead figure's head. It was not a warning shot. She had aimed for his chest. But 1-shot pistols are not accurate at distance, and the darkness and her shaking hands conspired against her. The figure stopped. The other 2 stopped behind him. Then Bull Harker's voice came out of the dark, low and amused. "1 bullet, Miss Jenkins. Maybe none now. And there are 3 of us." They were not bluffing. Bull touched the torch to the nearest hive. The dry wood caught instantly, flame leaping up in a rush of orange and gold. Sparks flew into the brown grass, and the grass began to burn, fire spreading outward in a widening ring. Rosalie did not think. She dropped the empty derringer on the kitchen table, grabbed the bucket from beside the stove, and ran outside. She ran straight toward the fire with her bucket and nothing else, a woman in a nightgown fighting an inferno with 10 quarts of water. She threw the water on the nearest burning hive, and the steam hissed and rose, and the flames pushed back for 1 second before surging forward again. Bull Harker stepped into her path. He was so large he blocked the firelight, casting her into shadow. Drummond sends his regards. He wants you to sign the deed, tonight. And the fire stops. Rosalie looked up at him, soot on her face, fire reflected in her green eyes, empty derringer somewhere behind her, not a weapon left in the world except her voice. Tell Drummond he can burn every hive I own. I will still be standing here when the ashes cool. Bull stared at her. Something shifted in his expression. Not respect exactly, but recognition. He had seen courage before. He had not expected to see it here. Then hoofbeats coming fast. Yates came over the rise at a gallop, Duke's hooves throwing clods of dirt into the dark. He rode straight into the firelit yard, swung down from the saddle before the horse had fully stopped, and hit the ground running. Bull turned. His hand went to his pistol. The two hired men stepped back, unsure, looking to Bull for direction. Yates stopped 10 paces from Bull. The fire roared behind them. Sparks swirled upward into the black sky like 1,000 tiny stars dying. "Emmett Harker," Bull said, "I know. And I will carry that until I die. But tonight is not about Emmett. Tonight is about her. Then draw, killer." The challenge hung in the air between them, heavy as smoke. Bull's hand was on his pistol. His eyes were steady. He wanted this. He had wanted it for 8 years. A fair fight. A righteous kill. An ending to the grief that had eaten him alive since the day his brother dropped on a sawdust floor in Abilene. Yates felt his hand move toward the Colt at his hip. The old instinct, the terrible speed that was the best and worst thing about him, pulling at his muscles like a current pulling at a drowning man. Draw, be fast, be first, survive. And then he saw Rosalie standing at the edge of the firelight, soot-streaked and trembling, watching him with those green eyes. And he made the choice that would define the rest of his life. He lifted both hands and held them out at his sides, palms open, fingers spread, empty. He walked toward Bull. 1 step, 2, 3. Each step a decision. Each step a refusal to be the man he had been in Abilene. "Shoot me," Yates said when he was 10 feet from Bull's pistol. "If killing me will take away what you feel, then do it. But it will not. I know because I killed your brother, and it did not stop me from being afraid. Not for 1 single day." Bull raised the gun. His hand was shaking. His finger was on the trigger, and his eyes were wet, and his jaw was clenched so tight the muscles jumped beneath his skin. Then Rosalie moved. She did not jump in front of Yates. She did not throw herself between them. She walked forward and placed herself beside him. Not in front, not behind, next to him, shoulder to shoulder. Because she would not let anyone die on her land, and because standing next to a man who had refused to draw a gun against the brother of the man he had killed was the bravest thing she knew how to do. "You want to shoot him," she said. "You shoot through me." Not brave, not theatrical. Stated as a fact, the way she might say the sun comes up in the east. Bull looked at the two of them standing there in the firelight. The woman he had been sent to destroy, and the man he had spent 8 years wanting to kill, standing together with empty hands and full hearts, and not a weapon between them. His gun hand shook. The barrel of the pistol dipped, rose, dipped again. Then from the road behind them, the sound of horses. 3 Rockingham hands came pounding into the yard, rifles out. Morrison's booming voice carrying over the fire's roar. "What in the blue blazes is going on here?" Bull's hired men broke and ran, disappearing into the dark like rabbits. Bull did not run. He stood where he was, gun still in his hand, and looked at Yates one last time. "This is not over," he said. But the words did not carry conviction anymore. They carried exhaustion, the deep, bone-weary exhaustion of a man who has been hating for so long, he has forgotten how to do anything else. He holstered the pistol, mounted his horse, and rode into the night. It took an hour to put the fire out. 3 hives were lost, and the chicken coop was gone. The barn had scorch marks on its eastern wall, and the grass was charred in a wide black arc behind the house. But the farmhouse stood. Most of the apiary survived, and no one was dead. Yates and Rosalie stood in the ash and the smoke, shoulder to shoulder. Their faces were black with soot. Their clothes were burned and torn. They looked at each other in the gray light of the dying embers. "You did not draw," Rosalie said. "No. Why?" "Because you taught me there are things worth protecting more than my own safety. And I did not want to be a man you had to fear." Rosalie looked at him for a long time. Then she took his hand. The hand that had killed Emmett Harker. The hand that had mended her fence and rebuilt her hives and cradled her face in the dark. The hand that had stayed open and empty when a gun was pointed at his chest. She held it tight and did not let go. Behind them, Morrison's men were throwing the last buckets of water on the smoldering grass. Morrison himself stood in the yard with a rifle across his arm, looking at the damage with the expression of a man who has seen enough of the world to know exactly what kind of animal leaves this kind of mark. "Drummond still holds the paper," Rosalie said. Her voice was raw from smoke. "He still owns the debt. Then tomorrow morning," Yates said, "we go find him." "And say what?" "The truth, in front of the whole town." On a Saturday morning in Ardmore, Silas Drummond unlocked his store at 7 o'clock sharp, same as every day, and found 30 people waiting on the boardwalk. Not one of them there to buy. They stood in a loose half-circle in front of the store, breath rising in white clouds in the December cold. Farmers in their work clothes, women with shawls pulled tight, a few cowboys from the Rockingham and other outfits, standing at the edges with their arms crossed. In the center of the group, Rosalie Jenkins and Yates Ingram stood side by side. Drummond took in the scene with the quick, calculating eyes of a man who has survived by reading situations the way other men read books. His expression did not change. He reached up and adjusted his sleeve garters and said, "Good morning. Can I help someone?" Morrison stepped forward. He was the most powerful rancher in 50 miles, and everyone on the boardwalk knew it. When Samuel Morrison spoke, people in Ardmore listened. "Drummond," he said, his voice carrying in the cold morning air, "I am here to inform you that the Rockingham will no longer be doing business with your store, and I have spoken to every outfit between here and the Washita River, and I expect they will be making the same decision before the week is out." Drummond's expression flickered. In a town with one store, a boycott by the region's largest ranch was not an inconvenience. It was a death sentence. Then Hattie Birdsong stepped forward, carrying her ledger. She opened it on the rail of the boardwalk and began to read. 4 families, 4 foreclosures, the same pattern each time. Drummond purchased debt at a discount. Drummond's store overcharged the farmers on goods they had no choice but to buy. Mysterious damage to property. Pressure from people who owed Drummond favors. Then, when the payment came due and the money was not there, Drummond seized the land. All legal, all documented. Behind Hattie came the Perkins family, gaunt and hollow-eyed, dispossessed 6 months ago. And the Warrens, who had lost 80 acres of good cotton land. And Harris, an honest trader from Tishomingo, who had examined Drummond's store scales and found them deliberately weighted 15% in the seller's favor. Every transaction that had ever taken place in this store had been rigged from the start. And behind them all, leaning against the rail with his arms folded and his star catching the morning sun, stood Territorial Judge Clement Whitaker, whom Morrison had brought from Oklahoma City. Not a federal judge. A territorial court judge with jurisdiction over civil and criminal matters in Indian Territory. Drummond watched it unfold with the stillness of a man watching his house burn from across the road. When the evidence had been laid out, when the scales had been weighed and found wanting, he played his last card. He stepped forward and raised his voice so the whole crowd could hear. "You are going to take the word of these people over mine? A respected businessman?" He pointed at Yates. "That man right there killed an unarmed drunk in a saloon in Abilene. Shot him dead with a Colt .45. Ask him. Ask him about Emmett Harker." The crowd went silent. Every eye turned to Yates. Rosalie felt his hand tighten around hers, then deliberately relax. Yates stepped forward. He did not lower his eyes. He did not make excuses. "I killed Emmett Harker in a saloon in Abilene 8 years ago. The court ruled self-defense. The truth is more complicated than that, and I have lived with it every day since. But my past does not change the numbers in that ledger, and it does not change the kerosene that was poured along Miss Jenkins's fence line, and it does not change the 3 men who set fire to her farm 2 nights ago." Drummond opened his mouth to respond, but the crowd's attention had already shifted, because someone else was stepping forward. Reverend Eli Crandall moved through the parting crowd like a man walking to his own hanging. His face was white, his hands were trembling. His collar was soaked through with sweat, despite the 30-degree morning. He stood before Judge Whitaker and began to speak. He told it all. 3 years of debt to Drummond. 3 years of coercion. Every family he had reported on, every confidence he had betrayed. The Perkins family's hidden savings, the Warrens' plans to sell timber, Rosalie's new buyers in Tishomingo. He named names and dates and amounts, his voice cracking and recovering and cracking again, and the crowd listened in terrible silence. When he finished, he looked at Rosalie. She remembered the brown paper package on her porch, the jar of honey, the wordless apology of a man too weak to speak but not too far gone to feel. She did not nod. She did not smile. But she did not look away. Judge Whitaker had heard enough. He ruled from the boardwalk, which was not how things were normally done, but these were not normal circumstances. The acceleration clause was void. Drummond had a conflict of interest so severe it poisoned every aspect of the transaction. He was the creditor, the sole local merchant, and the orchestrator of a deliberate campaign to prevent the borrower from meeting her obligations. The mortgage would revert to its original terms under the supervision of the territorial court. Rosalie would owe her regular monthly payments and nothing more. Furthermore, the judge continued, evidence of arson, destruction of property, and fraud has been presented to this court and will be referred to the territorial marshal's office for criminal investigation. Drummond stood on his boardwalk and listened to his world come apart. He did not shout. He did not curse. His face went blank the way a house goes dark when the last lamp is blown out. He looked at Yates and Rosalie with hollow eyes, then turned and walked into his store and closed the door. He would not open it again. Within a month, the territorial marshal would arrest him. He would be held in the county jail in Ardmore while awaiting trial. The territorial court would convict him of fraud and arson and sentence him to 3 years in the territorial prison. The man who had destroyed 4 families would finally face the law he had hidden behind for so long. The crowd was beginning to disperse when Bull Harker appeared. He had been standing at the far edge of the gathering, arms crossed, silent. Now he walked forward, and everyone who saw him tensed. The Rockingham hands moved their hands to their belts. Morrison shifted his weight. Even Judge Whitaker looked up sharply. Bull stopped in front of Yates. They were the same height, eye to eye, and the space between them was charged with 8 years of grief and rage and something that might, in a different life, have been understanding. "I do not forgive you," Bull said. "I am not asking you to," Yates replied. A long silence. Wind moved through the main street of Ardmore, kicking up dust and carrying the smell of smoke from somewhere distant. Bull's eyes moved to Rosalie, then back to Yates. "Emmett had a daughter," he said. "Her name is Martha. She is 8 years old, lives with Clara's people in Wichita. She needs schooling money." The words sat between them. Not forgiveness, not absolution. Something harder and more honest than either. A debt acknowledged. A responsibility named. A way forward that did not require anyone to pretend the past had not happened. "I will see to it," Yates said. Bull nodded once. He turned, mounted his horse, and rode out of Ardmore without looking back. After the crowd cleared, Yates and Rosalie stood alone in front of the store. The exact spot where they had met. The boardwalk where Yates had laid $20 on a counter and changed both their lives. You are not a good man, are you? Rosalie said. It was not a question. No. And I am not some helpless girl who needed saving. I know. You are the most terrifying person I have ever met. She almost smiled. Then what are we? Two people who are not perfect, trying to do right? Maybe that is enough. She kissed him. In the middle of the street, in front of God and the boardwalk, and whoever was still watching. And this time she did not care who saw. On the ride home, the winter sun pale and low on the horizon, Rosalie said quietly, "You still have not asked me, you know." Yates laughed, and for the first time she heard him laugh without any shadow behind it. A clean sound, clear as creek water. "Asked you what?" "You know what?" Yates Ingram proposed to Rosalie Jenkins on a March morning while she stood in her apiary wearing a veil and leather gloves with honey smeared on her apron, and he thought she had never looked more beautiful in her life. Spring had come to Oklahoma Territory the way it always did, slowly at first and then all at once. The prairie erupting in green and gold overnight as if the earth had been holding its breath all winter and finally let it go. The wildflowers were coming up in the fields, purple clover and Indian paintbrush and the bright yellow blooms that would feed the bees for months. Yates walked into the apiary at dawn. He had learned to move slowly among the hives, to keep his movements gentle and his voice low. Rosalie had taught him that, the way her father had taught her. The bees knew him now. They landed on his hat and his shoulders and crawled along his sleeves, and he let them, because she had shown him that they were only dangerous if you gave them reason to be. He found her bent over an open hive, lifting a frame thick with golden comb. The bees swirled around her in a living cloud, and the morning sun caught the honey on her fingers and turned it to liquid light. Rosalie. She looked up. Behind the veil, her green eyes were steady and warm. He knelt on the wet grass. A bee landed on his knee, and he did not move. He had no ring. He could not afford one. He had a horse, $40 in savings, and a past he would carry for the rest of his life. But he had something else, too. Something he had not had before he walked into Silas Drummond's store on a hot September afternoon and saw a woman standing alone against a cheat with nothing but her spine and her pride. "I do not have much," he said. "I have got a horse, $40 saved, and a past I will never outrun. But I have got two hands that know how to work, and a heart that does not beat for anyone but you. Rosalie Jenkins, will you build something with me?" Rosalie set the frame down. She pulled off her gloves. She lifted the veil. "I will," she said, "but you have to learn not to get stung first." He stood up and she kissed him, and a bee landed on his collar, and he held perfectly, completely, absolutely still. And Rosalie laughed until she could not breathe, and the sound of it carried across the prairie and mixed with the humming of the hives and the singing of the morning birds. And it was the best sound in the world. They married on the farm, not in the church, which was without a preacher now that Crandall had resigned and left Ardmore. Hattie Birdsong presided, blending Cherokee traditions with the Christian vows that Rosalie had grown up with. Morrison stood as witness, wearing his only suit, which was 20 years old and strained across his shoulders, and his eyes were suspiciously bright throughout the ceremony, though he would deny it to his dying day. Neighbors came, people who had known Thomas Jenkins, people who had watched Rosalie fight alone for 2 years, people who had stood on the boardwalk that December morning and seen justice done. They brought food and music, a fiddle and a guitar, and they danced in the yard as the sun went down. Rosalie wore her mother's dress, taken in at the waist and let out at the shoulders. Yates wore a suit borrowed from Morrison. They did not match, and they did not care. When the music faded and the guests went home and the stars came out over the prairie, Yates and Rosalie sat together on the porch that he had rebuilt and looked out at the land that she had saved. That night, Rosalie woke to find the bed empty beside her. She found him on the porch. He was sitting in the chair beside the railing, and in his hands he held the Colt, not pointed at anything, just held. Turned over slowly, the way a man turns over an old letter he cannot bring himself to throw away. Rosalie did not panic. She opened the screen door and sat down beside him on the porch boards, tucking her nightgown around her legs against the chill. "What are you thinking about?" Yates was quiet for a long time. The night was vast around them, the prairie stretching away under the stars. And somewhere in the distance a coyote sang its lonesome song. "I am thinking," he said, "that if I had not carried this gun into that saloon in Abilene, Emmett Harker would still be alive. His daughter would have a father. His wife would have a husband. His brother would not have spent 8 years hating me." He turned the Colt in his hands. "And I never would have come to Ardmore. Never would have walked into that store. Never would have met you." The wind stirred the grass. "Every good thing in my life started with the worst thing I ever did. I do not know how to live with that." Rosalie reached over and took the Colt from his hands. Not gently, not fearfully. Naturally, the way she would take a coffee cup or a jar of honey. She set it on the porch floor between them. Then she took both of his hands. She held them in hers, and she looked at them in the starlight. These hands had pulled a trigger in a sawdust saloon. These hands had mended fence wire and rebuilt beehives. These hands had cradled her face the first time he kissed her. These hands had stayed open and empty while a grieving man pointed a loaded pistol at his heart. "You live with it by living worthy of it," she said. "Every day, starting tomorrow." He pressed his forehead against hers. She pressed back. Neither of them spoke. The wind carried the faintest hum from the hives behind the house. The bees stirring in the warming spring, beginning their work again after the long winter silence. In the morning, Yates hung the Colt on a nail in the barn wall. He did not hide it. He did not throw it away. The past could not be discarded, only placed somewhere where it served as a reminder rather than a weapon. The months that followed were full of work and healing. The farm came back to life piece by piece, the way a body recovers from a fever, slowly at first, and then with gathering strength. Hattie's 5 borrowed hives, added to the 14 survivors, made 19. 3 new colonies swarmed in May, bringing the total to 22, more than Rosalie had ever managed. Yates built a new chicken coop, stronger and better positioned than the old one. Morrison lent him grazing land for 12 head of cattle, calling it not a gift but a loan, and saying he expected interest paid in honey. Rosalie sent the first shipment under the new label, Jenkins and Ingram Wildflower Honey. Harris, the honest trader from Tishomingo who had helped expose Drummond's rigged scales, took every jar she could produce and asked for more. Once a month, Yates mailed an envelope to Wichita. Inside was a money order for Martha Harker's schooling. It was Rosalie's idea to make it a standing commitment. Not a one-time payment, but a regular obligation. The way you pay a debt that can never be fully settled but must be honored anyway. They would send those envelopes for 10 years. Crandall had left Ardmore shortly after the trial. Before he went, he left a letter at the farm. 3 lines written in a shaking hand, asking forgiveness. Rosalie kept the letter in her father's desk. She had not answered it. She was not sure she ever would. But she had not burned it either. And that was its own kind of answer. The store that Drummond had owned sat empty for 2 months before Harris bought it, moved his operation from Tishomingo, and reopened it as a fair-dealing establishment. He kept the scales in plain sight, and anyone who wanted was welcome to check them. On a warm evening in late spring, Yates and Rosalie sat on the porch as they did every evening now, shoulder to shoulder, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. The hives hummed behind the house, steady and alive. The prairie grass rippled in the wind, gold and green, stretching out to the edge of the world. Rosalie placed her hand on her stomach. She did not say a word. Yates looked down at her hand, looked up at her face. His eyes went wide. She nodded. He did not speak. He could not. He pulled her close, and she rested her head against his chest, and they sat together in the fading light, listening to the wind and the bees and the sound of their own breathing. Inside the small farmhouse that her father had built with his own hands and that they had saved together, something new was growing, smaller than a promise. larger than a hope. Yates kissed the top of her head and felt something in his chest that he had not felt in so long he had almost forgotten its name. It was peace, not the absence of pain or the forgetting of what he had done, but peace despite those things, woven through them, earned by the daily work of living worthy. He thought about the day in the trading post, a dusty cowboy walking in to buy rope and tobacco, a woman with green eyes and white knuckles standing alone against a man who was trying to steal her livelihood, a jar of honey held to the light, glowing like liquid gold, $20 laid on a counter. That was all it had taken. One moment, one choice, one refusal to walk past an injustice. From that single moment, everything had grown. The partnership, the love, the fight, the fire, the justice, the child now growing in Rosalie's belly. All of it traced back to a cowboy who saw a trader cheating a woman on the price of her goods and decided he could not let it stand. The sun touched the horizon, and the sky turned colors that had no names, orange and pink and deep violet fading to indigo. The first stars appeared, faint and patient, waiting for the dark the way they always did. And somewhere behind the house in the gathering dusk, the bees kept working, patient, relentless, turning nectar into gold the way they always had, the way they always would, no matter what storms had come before. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.